So I want to welcome everyone for being here today. I feel really honored that you're here with Cal and I, and that you're part of this series that we have going on. I think it's going to be so much fun. I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about it because I'm thrilled to come in here and talk about something that I'm so passionate about and talk with people that I admire so much in the industry and have all of you be part of it. Um, I should say my name is Tina Vandenberg, and I have a sewing business called Kinship Handwork and a podcast called In Kinship. And this last year, actually, Cal is one of my first pattern drafting teachers. I learned to pattern draft from her on Creativebug. I don't even know how long ago. Before I met you at the retreat in Maine in 2017, several years before then, I took her courses and I read her book. If you are unfamiliar, Design It Yourself clothes. And so I've been sewing and doing clothing for a very long time, and I've been teaching for about maybe 8 or 9 years as well. And one of the things I often hear from my students is that they're afraid to make a mistake. They're afraid to waste fabric. They're afraid to sort of move on to the next level, whatever that level is. And so this last January, I took a friend of mine's course, Roxanne Camper. I took her course, skirt skills, just for the hell of it. Like, I already know how to draft skirts. I already know how to draft things, but I wanted to just sort of be a beginner again. And I knew that she had a different approach to doing things, and I was thrilled to sort of embrace that. So I took that course. She shifted my mindset in this really beautiful way that I wasn't expecting. And I thought, I want to talk with more sewers like this to see, like, because we can kind of get in our own space of how we do things, and to kind of break out of that and talk with somebody else about what is so important to them just had such appeal to me. And so Break the Rules of Sewing became a dream and a reality. And here we are today with our first speaker, Cal Patch. Cal, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, and to be the first guest is such an honor. And yeah, I vividly remember that week in Maine where we first met, and you did come with a whole wardrobe of beautiful knit garments. So it was clear that you had been learning and sewing for a while before then. And yeah, I'm just happy to be on board. How should we dive in?
Let me give, for those of you who are not familiar with Cal, which I find that hard to believe, but maybe there are a few of you who are not. Cal has been in the teaching in the textile industry, according to your website, since 2000, right? So that's, and then in my head, of course, I'm like, that wasn't that long ago. And then I'm like, oh, well, actually, we are aging. That's what we said. That was a lot, that was a good long time ago. And you have done so many amazing things. You have such a laid back way of teaching, and that comes through in your Creativebug classes, that comes through in your book. Let me show you again. Design It Yourself clothes. That comes through in the retreat that I met you at in Maine. And so 5 or 6 years ago, then I had you come to my first retreat and teach at my first retreat, which was an amazing experience to have as well. I've always admired your laid back way at going at clothing. And I wonder if you might give us a moment, if you might take a moment and tell us like your brief little timeline on how you went in those since 2000 to here in your clothing industry.
Sure. And I'll try to keep it brief because I feel like I've told this story a bunch of times before, but yeah, for people who don't know me, it might be interesting. So basically, the nutshell version is I did start out as a clothing designer in the garment industry for about 10 years in my 20s. And I quickly learned that the garment industry is not really a great place, and not where I wanted to spend the rest of my life working. So I left, and well, I left working in the actual industry and opened a little clothing store where I could just make clothes and sell them, and uh, sell other people's clothes. And this was in New York City. So I did that for a couple years, and it was really fun, but not a very successful business venture, but very successful in other ways because that was where I began teaching, mostly as a way to just sort of get people in the door of the shop because I was in a kind of remote neighborhood, and like New Yorkers are very um kind of fickle about like where they want to go in, and they'll only go into a place if it's like really crowded and there's a line around the block and it looks like there's something interesting going on. If there's no one in there, they're like, well, it must not be cool. So I was like, if I get people inside the door taking a class, it'll, when other people walk by, they'll be like, oh, there's something interesting going in, I need to find out what. So that was really my motivation for teaching. I really hadn't thought about like, am I a teacher? Can I teach? I just was like, I could show people how to crochet. So um that was where the teaching began. And then I quickly realized that teaching, like so many things about teaching, I loved it. I believe am pretty good at it. People seem to like taking the classes, and the fact that people would like sign up in advance, pay me, and I knew like when they were coming and when they were leaving was just an amazing thing, as opposed to having a store where you're like sitting there all day and no one might come in and no one might buy anything. Or they might come in for like 3 hours and talk your ear off, but not buy anything. So like all kinds of problems with having a store. And also I learned that I am not a good salesperson. I'm much better as a teacher because I feel good about sharing skills and teaching people how to do things, but I don't always feel comfortable like handing or people handing me money for something I made. Anyway, so shortly after I started teaching, I closed the store and opened a workshop space because that just seemed like the thing to do, obviously. And I did that for a few years. And then I just started teaching at shops and retreats and studios and big events all over the country. And that's really what I've been doing for the past 20 years or so, is teaching anywhere that'll have me to teach and anywhere that seems fun to go. And I just love it. I love sharing what I know and empowering people to learn to make their own clothes and not have to worry about sizes or, what the industry thinks is in at the moment, but rather like taking charge of what do you want to wear? What do you feel comfortable in? What do you like? And being able to make that even if it's not the thing that the stores are selling that season. Yeah, so that's the nutshell.
I love that nutshell. And I can attest you are um you're an excellent teacher. I love that your laid back way of going at things. I think we very much resonate in that way. This kind of like, it's gonna all work out. Just keep going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Don't stress about it.
So I wonder if you might begin sort of the official part of this and telling us why sewing. Why did you take up sewing? Not necessarily why do you teach it to others, but why is sewing clothing important to you, and what made young Cal pick it up to begin with?
That is a good question. I don't know that I've really ever thought about like why sewing for me, but then the way you asked the question, I realized the chain of events that sort of led to it that is a good answer. So I'll back up to why clothing design or fashion design, and that came about because as a teenager, I wanted to go, at a certain point as a teenager, you start having to decide like what you're gonna do with yourself and are you going to go to college, what you're going to major in, all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to go to art school and be an artist, but I also didn't really know what an artist was or what they did, or I'd never met an artist. I grew up outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and it just sort of seemed like a vague, unclear profession. So And I'm a very, even despite being creative, I'm also very practical. And like, even as a kid, I was like, I want to be able to have a job and get a paycheck. I don't want to be a starving artist, which is the only kind I'd ever heard of. So, so I came up with the idea that clothing design would be like a creative field that could also get me a job. Um, and I had never met anyone in the clothing design field either, but my logic was everyone wears clothes, and therefore somewhere, somehow there must be jobs where people are in the world of making the clothes. So that was my logic. My mother supported it, and she also didn't think going to art school was a good idea. So I went to fashion design school, and so that was where I really learned how to sew properly. Um, and it goes hand in hand. A lot of designers don't actually know how to sew, but I was glad that where I went to school, we learned a full sewing and pattern drafting education, because I think it's really important to understand the nitty-gritty of how clothes are made. But then I didn't really sew my own clothes for like that next 10 years when I worked in the industry, because there just wasn't any time. Like, we worked such long hours. But it was kind of after getting out of the not working full time anymore, or full time is not even accurate, because it was like twice full time or something. It was so many, it was crazy. um but anyway, so it was when I opened the store, I started being able to like make clothes for myself and make clothes to sell, and really like exploring the clothing making. um yeah, so it came from a practical decision, and then I just sort of dove in and embraced it as like a creative yet practical for me, because I made it my job
Right.
thing to do.
So would you say, probably a lot of us here on this call started out by finding a pattern, deciding to take that pattern and create a piece of clothing for ourselves, right? That's probably how a lot of us got started. In hearing your story, it sounds like maybe that wasn't your beginning. Were you ever a home sewist?
Yeah, that I'm glad you say that, because on my walk earlier, when I was thinking about what I would talk about, this is one of the interesting, or I don't know if it's interesting, but an unusual thing maybe about me is that I do come in from kind of a different angle, and I really was never a home sewist. Um, because still to this day haven't used that many commercial sewing patterns or even indie sewing patterns. I do make things from sewing patterns frequently, but no, compared to a lot of people I know who've made just like tons of them and for many years, I mostly have always worked with my own self-drafted patterns, because I come from the design industry and um that world. Yeah, in fact, I can remember early in my teaching career when I decided to teach a class from a commercial pattern, and like, the class was like ready to launch or ready to happen, and I don't know, it was probably a couple weeks before, but people were signing up, and I was like, well, I guess I should make a sample of this garment from this pattern. And it kind of like threw me for a loop, because it turned out to be rather a more challenging pattern than I thought. And it wasn't a good pattern to teach a class about, because the very first step was really hard and kind of discouraged people. But I just remember, yeah, like learning a lot that first time I really sewed from a commercial pattern, and had thought it would be so like straightforward and easy, but it was not.
I can hear that. So I wonder then, as somebody who came from the industry, if you will, and became a teacher of home sewing people, I mean, you kind of
Yeah.
touched on that with this pattern that you're talking about, but like, did you find it challenging to take your skill set and shift it to something that would be easily adaptable for for folks that you were teaching? Or is that sort of what led you to create, like your book as an example, design it yourself clothing and like go into the realm of like, let's draft it yourself? How did that process go for you?
Yeah, I know. It's interesting to think back on like how things actually happened. Like, yeah, so I guess there were a few years where I was teaching sewing, but kind of basic sewing, because it was always a problem that people needed some kind of pattern to use, but I didn't really feel great about using other people's patterns to teach. And like it was hard to find patterns that fit everybody and that had good directions and all that stuff. Um, so after, and I do teach a lot of adjacent things to sewing, like crochet and embroidery and block printing and stuff like that. So I was teaching all those things, but pretty beginner level for most of them. And then at a certain point, people were asking me like to teach pattern drafting. And so I started teaching that, which is interesting because the way we learned pattern drafting in school, and from what I've heard from people I've asked who go to like Parsons and FIT now, this is kind of still the way they teach it. It didn't really make sense to me. And I mean, I don't know how it makes sense to anyone really. And like, we never really drafted from scratch, and we never used our own measurements because it wasn't about making clothes for yourself in the industry. It was about, making everything for like a size 6 fit model. And then other people would grade it up and down and all that stuff. So um, basically, I kind of developed my own way of pattern drafting based on what I had learned in school, but also just sort of mixing it with kind of a logical, like, well, if I know my measurements and I know how patterns work and I just start plotting them out on paper, and the fact that like the clothes we wear these days are very simple, really. Like, we're not wearing elaborate, many seamed, very fitted garments. So if you combine all that, I kind of just came up with a way to plot out your measurements and really simplified the process, which is why my book is called, the little subtitle is Pattern Making Simplified. And design it yourself. Yeah, because it's like you should be the one to decide what you want to make. Um, yeah, so that was how the pattern drafting came in. And then that was really where I found my niche as a teacher, because still to this day, there aren't that many people teaching pattern drafting. But that is my specialty. And then that made sense to like draft the pattern, and then I show how to sew the garment, because well, there might be many catches, but one of the big catches to drafting your own pattern is that it doesn't come with instructions. So you have to kind of be empowered to sew it yourself. I mean, you might be able to find a similar garment with instructions in the pattern to use, but you're kind of on your own. But that's okay, because then you can make your own rules, right?
Exactly. Speaking of rules, there's a nice little segue there. You know that part of what I want to talk about in this series are the ways that you do this. You take your sewing journey and you make it really independent to you. And so actually I'm gonna back up. I'm gonna shift for a minute. I want to come to that in a minute. So hold that thought. Before we do that, I want to see or hear a picture, paint us a picture, if you will, of if you today, Cal of today, 2024 Cal, if you're going to start a new project, what does that look like? Like, do you get your cup of tea? Do you get your sketchbook? Like, what does that process look like? And how do you go through to your finished garment? Generally, obviously, we all have different ways. Like sometimes for me, it's like a very much a thought out process. And sometimes it's like, I need a dress for tonight, so I'm going to make it. Right. So, but in your perfect world and the ways that it works more often than not, walk us through that process.
Yeah, wow. So that's, yeah. I, like you said, there are many different ways it can happen. Um, but let's see, to walk through the sort of ideal process. Um, there is, well, before there's a sketch, I was gonna say there it starts with a sketch, but it probably doesn't usually start with a sketch. And I'll have ideas percolating in my head for years and years. I move very slowly. I'm not one of those people who makes like 100 garments a year and then brings half of them to a clothing swap or something. I'm like very slow. Um, so often something's been percolating and brewing in my head. Often it comes from sort of a need or a void in my wardrobe where I'm like, I need something to wear that, when I'm going for walks or working in the garden, I have enough pockets. It's usually about pockets. The dress I'm wearing right now has 4 pockets. I'm just gonna put that out there. Um, but so usually there's some kind of idea about like something I need or like, something to put on when it's a little chilly or I don't know, just basic ideas like that. They're not anything radical. And then that'll just sort of rest in my head for years. But then I'll see something like that excites me. Like lately, I've been into like using scraps and piecing them together. So I might see like a tutorial about, like I watched one yesterday where somebody took a giant pile of scraps and pieced them all together and made 21 feet of fabric yardage that's tiny pieced patchwork scraps. Yeah, it was amazing. It kind of blew my mind. So like I'll see something like that and I'll be like, I need to do that. And then I might like combine it with, oh, and I've been wanting to make like a basic tank top, that I can wear whenever. So I think it's often like a merging of like a garment type and a technique that I want to play with. And that's when I'll like actually motivate and decide to do something about it. And then maybe at that point there might be a sketch because I do find a sketch will really help you kind of hone in on what you're doing. Um, so I always try to encourage my students to sketch, even though they often are resistant. But even like the worst, crudest sketch will still help you kind of decide like, what kind of armhole are you doing? How long is the sleeve? All that stuff. Um, so then I might either draft a pattern from scratch or more likely adapt a pattern I already have because I'm definitely all about the pattern hacking. Because honestly, I don't draft from scratch all that often. I have my basic patterns and those are what I use to start from. So I would probably hack a pattern and then I would make one in like some fabric that I've had sitting around for a long time or an old sheet or something like that. Something that's going to be wearable. I don't tend to use actual muslin. I tend to use either like upcycled fabrics or just fabric I've had for a while and I'm not that attached to. So it's not a travesty if it doesn't work out, which does happen. But if it does work out, I'm going to be able to wear it and use it. And then the next phase, which I'll admit I often don't actually get to, is it would be to make a second one that's like got all the kinks worked out and in the fabric of my dreams. But mostly my favorite fabrics like sit on my shelf and don't get used because I'm one of those people who like saves the good fabric. I'm trying to get over it. I've made progress, but
Mhm.
um I'm much more comfortable using the fabric that I don't totally love or that's not replaceable or something.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can hear this, and I wonder, I certainly have that same hang up, and I know that definitely the students that I teach have that same sort of hang up that they're afraid to, I don't know, you didn't use the word afraid, but they're sort of afraid to use that good fabric for their project. And I sometimes also get stuck on that. I've made something out of a fabric I like well enough to try out my design because I also like to use tried and true kind of simple patterns and then adapt them into other things. That's definitely
Mhm.
my forte as well. And then I don't always go from that first version to the final version, and that's something that I'm trying to embrace more of in my artistry. So that leads me to the next question I have here. I wonder what your favorite part of sewing is and what your least favorite part of sewing is.
I love these questions. You would think I would know the answer to that one, but there's a lot of favorite parts. I definitely love the just sort of like marinating and being inspired phase, which is why it can go on for years. Um, but then I get frustrated, like, why have I not done this thing? I've been thinking about it for 10 years. Definitely literally have things I've thought about for 10 years. Like well, I won't go into what I need, but like there's one in my mind right now that I'm like, why have I still not made it? Um, but I think it's partly because I just love that phase, and I love the fabric. I love the fabric shopping, though I've pretty much cut out the fabric shopping because I have plenty of fabric. So now it's just shopping in my stash and finding something, um, you know, the right fabric for the project. Um, I do love that part. And then I know what my least favorite is, cutting, which I always say is unfortunate because it comes first. At least first in the actual action of making the thing. Um, yeah, I just don't love cutting, and I don't know. I wish it could be better, but really it doesn't take that long and I should just suck it up and do it. So, that's my least favorite, but maybe my favorite actual part of sewing is just sort of, I like when the pieces are cut out and you actually start putting them together. And I like, when you go from like 8 or 10 pieces cut out and they like start getting attached to each other, and the moment where they're all connected. It may not be done yet, but I like when it's all stuck together and I can't like lose any of the pieces anymore. I'll go with that.
I like that. I like that. Is Do you think that the resistance to creating that final garment out of that nice fabric is because the fabric is precious, or is it because you sort of already done it and you don't really want to do it again?
Yeah, good question. Both I think are valid points. I definitely suffer from the precious factor, and I really admire when I have people in class who like come to class to make their very first skirt ever, and they've brought the like Nanny Aero fabric or something, and I'm always like, "Ooh, are you sure?" Like I want to say maybe save that for your second one, but then I admire that they are ready to go for it, and I don't want to like put my own worries onto them. So, um anyway, I suffer from the precious fabric syndrome, but I do also, now I'm blanking on what the other thing was, but what was the other choice that you suggested?
Sort of that feeling of like you've already done it and it's not new and fresh anymore.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
To move
Yeah.
on to something else or think
Yeah.
about something else.
Yeah. Usually that first one that I make that I talked about a minute ago, like I love it, and it does sort of satisfy the itch, and the burn, like when I'm going through the whole process, the sometimes many year process, it's always that like holy grail one that's in my head. But then the one that I actually do, that's sort of the working muslin prototype, that that does usually satisfy me and make me happy. And I kind of forget about making that second one. And that's why the fabric stays on the shelf. So it's a bad sort of vicious cycle that gets repeated. Um but then I'm like, I have all these tried and true patterns that I've made a great garment that I love and wear. So I should make a second and third and fourth one. Um, because yeah, I'd have a wardrobe full of things I love. Because the hardest work is getting to the point of that first garment and getting through it. And usually there are a few little tweaks that I might do differently next time because you learn a lot the first time you make something. But yeah, I usually don't ever get to that second version. I
Right.
think for the two reasons that you called out.
Yeah, I have that same, I can have that same issue, and I'm trying to shift that because as a as a sewing teacher, I don't know if this ever happens to you, but I'll wear what was going to be a muslin that I didn't maybe finish as cleanly as I could have because of like it was just a muslin, and then I'll wear it to a class, and someone will be like, "Oh, that's amazing! Can I see?" And they'll grab your sleeve and look
Right.
underneath, and you're like, "Oh no, don't look at this!" And then like I think that maybe if I did that second version, then I might be happier with people looking in my insides.
Interesting. That doesn't happen to me usually because I usually do. I'm like team French seam all the way. So even my so-called, I don't really think of it as a muslin, but I think of it as like a wearable muslin. And to me, that means I'm gonna finish all the seams and do all the things. But that's not to say I don't. I do sometimes have samples that I bring to a class that I'm like things I made for the book or something where that not everything is perfect inside and I'm like, don't look inside. But usually the ones I'm wearing are finished.
Nice.
Um, yeah.
Nice. So French seams are your favorite for finishing your inseam. How do
Yeah.
you finish? Do you sew with knits often, and how do you finish those?
Um, I usually don't finish the edges of my knits
Mhm.
because they really don't need it, you know? I mean, I will hem some some things with knits. I'm wearing leggings right now and the bottoms are not hemmed. I almost never hem my leggings because I feel like the raw cut edge looks cleaner even with a little bit of a roll that it usually has than any hem I can do.
Mhm.
And I just sort of like the look better. But the seams, I usually just sew them with a nice stretchy seam and maybe trim them down a little if they're, if I've got a full 5/8 inch of seam allowance, that's often a lot of fabric flopping around on the inside, but I really don't finish them because generally your knits are just good to go. Like they just don't unravel or fray.
Nice.
Occasionally you run into one that will, and then it needs finishing, but
Yeah. Yeah. Very nice.
I think we might have bonded over that early on too. Like
French seams or unfinished knits.
unfinished. I don't even want to call them unfinished because it sounds like we're like cheating or being lazy, but it's they if they don't need it, why do it?
Right.
I mean, occasionally there are reasons why, like you want to do a flat felled seam or something, but
Yeah.
generally I'm like, why should I bother?
Yeah. I can see that. Yes. I have that same. I've probably more dresses with a raw edge than I do a finish edge because I am almost exclusively a knit garment sewist because I love total mobility. Oh,
Right.
today, I don't know if you can see this, but I am wearing a top that I drafted probably 10 years ago in the class that I took with you.
Beautiful.
So I had to wear it today in honor of this conversation.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'm having one thought too about the finishing of knits that probably people are thinking, which is that I'm not a huge serger user, and I know a lot of people. Do you usually use a serger when you sew your knits?
I do, but that's relatively new for me. So probably for 10 or 15 years I did not, and I had great
Yeah.
success.
Yeah, because obviously if you sew with a serger, then your edges are all finished. But the to me, the reason to use the serger is more about that really stretchy seam and the fact that it goes really fast compared to all the stretchy stitches on the sewing machine, and it's just a really good strong seam. But it does finish the edges, but they really just don't need finishing,
Yeah,
in my opinion.
nice. Cal, what are the ways that you think coming back to our original topic here, what are the ways that you think that you break the rules of sewing? What are the ways that you are like, I do this way because this is the Cal way to do it, and I know other people do it differently, but this is what I do.
Well, again on my walk, I was like, how do I break the rules? What are the rules? And one because I'm always bad at like thinking of, examples to answer a question. So I was trying to practice. Um, and one thing I definitely came up with was the fact that I don't finish my knit edges, and I don't always hem in fact, I always don't hem my leggings. Um, but then I kind of came around to that, like, what are the rules idea? And really what I love about everyone learning sewing in order to do what they want to do is that you're making the rules. So who's to even say what is a rule? The only rules I will really acknowledge as rules are the ones that are like, your clothes are going to fall apart, like back stitching, let's say. Back stitching is pretty essential. I feel like if you don't back stitch the beginning and end of every seam, your clothes are probably going to come apart a lot sooner. So that kind of rule I'm fully in support of, and I would not suggest breaking that rule. But when it comes to like creativity and playing around and experimenting and not getting stuck and not letting the fear of trying something paralyze you, which all of which I see a lot, that's where I'm like, there should not be any rules. There are no rules. You create your own parameters. I do love parameters. It's always fun to have like kind of create a project for yourself. And like, otherwise I tend to get overwhelmed if I have no restriction at all. So I love parameters, but like actual rules, I just don't even, I'm kind of not even aware of what the rules are, or I make them up myself. Um, yeah, so I don't know if that really answered the question, but because
It
you
did.
wanted,
It
good,
did.
okay.
I knowing you as I do, I would guess that that you probably are not stymied by the way things should be done, and that
Yeah,
and that openness to be like, this is your creativity, this is your process, you get to do it how you want to. And even when you talked earlier about how when you teach people to pattern draft, then you have to sort of show them how to sew if they're not familiar with it, because they may just not have the skills to know how to get from here to there.
right,
But then ultimately, part of the beauty of pattern drafting is you get to finish it however you want to. Not only just your raw edges and your French seams, but like you get to decide like, how do you want the neckline to be? Is it going to be a face? Is it going to be have a binding? What is it going to have? And you get to make all those decisions yourself. So like that, I can completely see how that would be like, what rules? What are you talking about?
exactly. I saw we just got a comment where someone said backstitching is overrated. So, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. If it works for you, if your clothes don't fall apart, don't backstitch them. Like, there's many ways to do everything. I'm in full support of people trying out whatever they think is best for them. And I can only report on my own experience.
Yeah, I love it. So before we open this up for folks to ask you questions directly, I wonder if you might leave our everyone here today with, um, I told the story earlier on about how I went to become a beginner again this year because I just wanted to embrace a way of sewing that was sort of different than mine, and well, quite a bit different than mine. And I changed my mindset, and it was really beautiful. And it gave me this deeper, like, help me move deeper into the things that I want to continue to elevate about my artistry. Because I do think of it as my artistry, and I'm very practical, kind of like you are too. So like it has this, I love things of utility. So all that fits in. But if somebody listening wanted to elevate whatever that means for them, and obviously this is a create your own adventure kind of a thing, but if they wanted to elevate their sewing experience or their garment making experience, do you have one tip that you might be able to share with them today?
One tip.
Or 10. It could be even.
Um, hmm. I think, well, I guess I'm stalling. Um,
Yeah.
uh, so I wore this dress on purpose today because, and it may be, a lot to some people. People may not want to have like this much stuff going on, but I think where I've been getting excited lately, and there's definitely a whole spectrum of possibility here, but I think a fun idea that we could all embrace is to go a little bit beyond just making the garment and thinking a little bit about how can this garment become a little bit more of an expression of your self, your creativity, your playfulness, or whatever you want to express. And so it doesn't have to mean like patchwork and applique and embroidery all on the same thing, but even just maybe adding like a little hand stitch detail around the neckline, or a little facing that's in a contrast fabric, like just sort of, I don't want to say thinking outside the box because that's so overused, but just like, doing one little thing differently than you might automatically do it. And sometimes this happens out of necessity, like you don't have enough of your fabric to make the facing or the pockets or something, and you're like, oh man, what am I going to do? And then you realize, like, well, I have plenty of other fabric and plenty of scraps. And sometimes using something else can actually make it such a more fun and playful and happier garment. So just sort of like, yeah, tweaking some things, making some choices outside of your normal plan of action, or embracing those kind of happy accidents, so that often I think the piece will come out with a little more of your own personality and flavor, and better than it would have if you just kind of went through the steps like you normally would. How's
Yeah,
that?
I love that. That's perfect. Anytime I've hand sewn something, like I like to just, I'm kind of a minimalist to some degree, not completely, as you can see behind me, but I like to get rid of things as they no longer fit. I like to only have things in my very curated life. I like to have only things in my life that I absolutely love. But I'll hang on to a hand sewn or even just hand sewn elements, a hand sewn garment, because it brings me so much joy. Even if I'm not wearing it so much anymore, there's just some joy to like slowing that process down and taking the time to do something a little special. And it doesn't even have to be hands on, it might be pin tucks or it might be some other little element to that basic that I am doing. So
Yeah.
I can see how that would elevate for sure. Cal, before we open this up to the questions, which we have a few over here that are pretty fun, I wonder how, well, let me back up and say, all of you listening are able to find all of Cal's links on our home for the Break the Rules of Sewing website. You can find her on Instagram, all of that stuff right there on that site. But what are you excited that you're doing right now that people might want to know about?
They're all such good questions, that I should practice my answers for. Um, what am I excited about? I mean, so many things, but the let's say every year I go teach several retreats in Maine, which is where I met you, Tina. So the Madamic Fiber Arts Retreat in Maine is in July, last week of July, first week of August. There's 2 weeks this year. We've doubled it because we want more people to come and have fun. And it's kind of like going to summer camp as an adult with lots of sewing and other fiber arts. So it's pretty amazing, and I would highly recommend checking it out.
Nice. And you can find out more about that at calpatch.com. But again, if you get onto our website where you've got the link to get into this show today, you can get all the links for Cal there too. So, all right. Okay. So we have several questions over here. I'm going to look at the chat. I'm going to kind of go back to the beginning of them and see. And if you, some great comments about Liberty of London Fabrics, having Cal back to Mackinac Island. That would be super fun. Wearable muslins. So the first question from Nancy. Nancy, would you like to come on live and ask that question? If so, you can unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, I'll ask it to, or have Cal read it independently. I'll give you a moment here.
People are shy to come on Zoom.
Okay, that's totally fine.
I'm just
So
guessing.
I will read the questions in the chat, and then after that, if we have some time and anybody wants to pop in, you can just raise your hand and you can come in and talk with Cal and I, because we are very friendly. I don't know if you noticed that, but we are. So Nancy's saying, are your tried and true patterns when you create it, or you're using a commercial pattern and hacking it?
They are, well, I was gonna say all, but I guess I do have a few commercial, but generally they're my own self-drafted patterns, because I teach like six or more different garments, and then they're all like extremely hackable. They're all like basic distilled versions of each thing. And then, yeah, the biggest part of my teaching now is like how to hack all those things and basically make them become whatever you want. So mainly they are my own patterns.
I might jump on that just for a moment too, because I have that. We have a very similar process, although I'm using knits primarily and not wovens. But I also, most of my tried and true are my own patterns that I've drafted. But occasionally I'll either clone something that I absolutely love, and that becomes a basic that I'll use to hack into other things. Or I'll have a commercial pattern that I really like, but usually it's got really basic lines to it. And for whatever reason, it fits me really well. So there's no reason for me to feel like I need to reinvent the wheel. I can just use that to go. So I'm just reiterating really what Cal said. All right. And then Jan says, do you use a serger or only sewing machine, which you sort of touched on earlier?
Yeah, I mostly use the sewing machine, and hand sewing is my sort of latest obsession. Like this garment that I'm wearing is 100% hand sewn. And I've been teaching a lot of classes in that, which I never ever thought I would be doing, but I like that it becomes very portable, and it now my hand sewing competes with my crochet, because like couch time or airplane time I can be hand sewing. But I use my serger very little. I don't really know why. I think it's the only reason I know of is that I like to dispel the myth that you need a serger to sew knits, which I hear people say all the time, and they think like they can't even try to sew with knits if they don't have a serger. And I don't think most people should buy a second machine before they know they want or need it, because most people don't have time to use their sewing machine enough. So like having two machines sitting in your closet just seems silly to me. Yeah, so long answer to a short question.
I love it. All right. Jean says, some teachers stress stay stitching and others don't mention it. What is your opinion on stay stitching?
Ah, very good question. I know I say that about every question, but they're all good. Um, I have a habit of forgetting to tell people to stay stitch or to do it myself. I do think it's a very useful and important thing to do. But I think the reason I can get away with skipping it a lot of the time is I have sort of innately trained myself to be very careful and gentle with like a cut curved edge if I've got something sewn together at the shoulder seams, but it's got its like neckline and armhole raw. I'm not gonna like try it on a million times and like stretch it over the ironing board and all the things I see people doing in class. I treat it very gently and carefully until the curves are finished. So I think that's why stay stitching doesn't you know, it doesn't cause me any trouble that I don't do it, but I think it's probably a good idea. And the reason why most sewing pattern instructions begin with stay stitch the neckline is for good reason, because a lot of people are not trained to not do any of those things. And if you stretch out your neckline, it can be hard to go back or impossible. So
Yes.
do as I say, not as I do.
So the next we have our comment about backstitching being overrated. And then we have after that, B. Bartlett says it's a great tip. Instead of backstitching, dial your stitch size down for the last few or the first few. Do you ever do that? I've never done that.
I've not done that in place of backstitching. I feel like I do it. I don't really quilt, but like if I'm this I sewed by hand, but like if I was piecing this by machine, I would turn my stitch length down because I do a lot of like chain piecing where you can backstitch, but it's going to slow you down so much. And I know quilters don't backstitch, and maybe it was a quilter who said backstitching is overrated. I'm still wrapping my head around not backstitching in quilting. But like I said, I'm mainly quilting for clothing, so it's not just going to be a quilt. But anyway, I do know that turning your stitch length down helps, but I've not done it just in place of backstitching. I don't think I'll ever do anything in place of backstitching on garment seams. I feel like they're very important, and I'm very much all about doing whatever I can for the longevity of a garment, even though I'm really into mending as well. I want my clothes to last, and I even though I love mending, I know that when things go into the mending pile, they do often stay there longer than I want, and I like to keep them in rotation. So I'm a big advocate of backstitching, but the tiny stitches probably work well too. I might start doing that as well as backstitching. I often backstitch twice too, because
Nice.
I like a secure end to my seam.
Right, right, right. And one of the things I definitely teach in my classes is like probably one of the rules for me is like don't use vintage or weak thread, which is the same kind of concept. It's like don't use any like don't let your stitches come out, right? Like don't let them break if you can help
No
it.
vintage thread for the actual machine sewing. If you want to use it like decoratively for hand sewing or something, it's fine. But yeah,
Yeah,
no vintage thread.
yeah. So Janice has a question that probably the rest of us all have as well. What is the clothing rack behind you, Cal?
Well, mostly it's there to block some of the clutter that's behind me. And I actually tried to center it. I was in my mind, it was going to go across the whole screen, but that didn't work. So, but it is all samples for classes I teach. And basically they're all the thing that I call the boxy tee, which is like the wonder garment. The dress I'm wearing is also a boxy tee. It really just means it has like a built-in sleeve, so there's no armhole and sleeve cap. Um yeah, so it's the class I teach most, and I feel like it's sort of the desert island class or pattern. If you could only pick one, you could have a boxy tee pattern and you can make it into almost anything you dream up except pants.
Nice. Very nice. Do you, Carol Johnson asked, you use a facing for your embroidery when you add embroideries? Like, I'm assuming she means like in the shirt you have on right now, is there a facing there? Or maybe she means something else. Carol, jump in if that is the case.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean, Carol. I there's nothing behind wherever there's embroidery or stitching, there's nothing behind it, like interfacing or stabilizer, maybe you mean. No.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Okay. I think like when you're embroidering on knits, that might be more important because the stretchy knit can be awkward to stitch on, but yeah, I don't this is linen, so it's pretty stable, and I don't even use a hoop. That's a rule I break, but it's not exactly a garment sewing rule, but I never use a hoop. I like to work with the fabric in its sort of relaxed, natural state because it's going to be a garment that I'm going to wear, not like a stretched on a frame on the wall kind of thing. So I'm hoopless.
Our next question is from Gail, and I want to apologize to Amanda. Amanda is here helping us out today. Amanda, love you having you here in the background. I see that you've been sending me direct messages, and I totally didn't see any of them. So sorry
That's
about
okay.
that.
There's another question from Jan as well before that.
From Jan. Can
Yeah.
you read it to me real quick?
The French seams. Cal talked about French seams. How does that apply when doing the patchwork as in the dress she is wearing?
Okay, thank you.
So the patchwork would not be done with French seams. This is sort of an applique. Let me come up a little higher so you can see the bottom. It's sort of an applique little yoke piece. So I hand pieced it, and then but all the edges inside of the patchwork are raw, but it's laid on top of the dress. So it's those raw edges get encased just like they would in a quilt. So the French seams are independent of the patchwork. French seaming does get a little thick in patchwork, but usually I don't do it.
Perfect. Gail asks, fitting seems like it's a really horrifying experience. Is it really?
No, it's not horrifying. So I will say that the clothes that I teach and make tend to not be super fitted.
Mhm.
I mean, it doesn't mean they're not like super baggy, though they could be. And sometimes I do make things super baggy, but like you can see this is like fitting pretty close to my body. I mean, when I lift up my arms, it's not as close to my body. But I make pretty simple garments, and the fitting is generally fairly straightforward. It's usually just like when you first draft a pattern and make a muslin, and when I do like truly draft a new pattern from scratch, I will make a real muslin with no finished seams just to try it on and test the pattern. So I should clarify that. But often there's just a little tweaking in like some of the angles or the necklines and things, but the fitting is usually pretty reasonable. It's not a big deal, I don't think.
Thank you for answering that. It's probably what has kept me from making a lot of garments because it just seems so like I can never do that.
Yeah, I think in the past, traditionally, people there was a lot more fitting involved because I think clothes in past decades were made to be much more fitted, and people had expectations of them being much more fitted. But if you think about the clothes that you probably buy and wear these days, they're generally not like, they don't have a lot of darts or seams or things that allow for fitting. Like, I mean, knits are amazing because they mold themselves to you. And people often think knits are going to be really difficult, but they're actually not. Tina will tell you, I will tell you. Knits are, once you just get over the tiny hurdle of understanding that your seams need to be stretchy, which you can do even with a zigzag on your sewing machine, they're actually a lot easier because the fit is so forgiving, which is why we all love t-shirts and leggings and sweatpants and stuff, because they're knits and they just they work with us. They allow us to move and all that stuff. But yeah, don't be intimidated by fitting. It's not hard. It's
Thank you
very
so much.
You're welcome.
I always give a tip to my students too, is that, and it's just like to keep it brief because I know we're running out of time here, but when you look in the mirror and you have on a piece of clothing that you've made and you instinctively, and like you keep pulling up the shoulder or you keep pulling in the side, whatever you're sort of instinctually doing to make it fit you better is probably exactly what it needs.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you're pulling up the shoulder, then just imagine like maybe this bodice part needs to be a different slope or a different shape. Like, so
Yeah.
just trust your intuition.
Yeah. Yeah. It's usually when you try something on for the first time and look in the mirror, if there's anything that needs to be done, it will kind of be pretty obvious, like,
Yeah.
you know, drag lines or something. But also I think we need to often just relax we tend to be hypercritical. And by we, I don't mean myself, but I see my students try things on and they're immediately drawn to like all the things that they think are wrong with it. But then I'm like, if you put back on your regular clothes, they all do that too. Like sometimes we just don't see things the same way. Not to say that our regular clothes couldn't be improved on, but I kind of think like fit is a construct and like we can relax, no pun intended, our expectations of fit. Like, if there are there's always going to be some wrinkles under your armpit. Like that's just going to happen. Because we need to be able to move and bend and you need extra fabric to do that. So, but yeah, fitting shouldn't be hard. And the simpler the garment, the easier the fitting is.
Nice. Let's do, we have another one here. We are getting at 104. Are you all right, Cal, if we asked her?
Yeah, I can go a few more minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So the next question is from Jane, and she asks, are there rules to take a woven drafted pattern to a knit? Speaking of knits.
Woven to knit. So that's the easier direction to go. And I'm assuming she means like a pattern that you buy. You can correct me if I'm wrong in that assumption, but so going from woven to knit will just make the garment seem possibly a little bigger, which might be fine, but like knits, oftentimes we want them to fit us a little more closely because they're knits, they can fit closely, but still give us movement and comfort. Whereas wovens always need a little bit of extra ease. We haven't really said the word ease yet, but ease is the way I define ease is the difference between a garment's measurements and your body measurements. So you need more ease in woven garments because they don't stretch. So you can always go from woven to knit, but you might think the knit garment is a little too loose, or you might not. But so you could size down a size or two, but you just want to check those measurements on the size chart to figure out if you need to go 1 or 2 sizes.
Nice.
Jean
And
just
going
popped
from
in
knit,
saying,
what?
oh, Jean just popped in saying that she drafts her own patterns.
Oh, well, so then you could either grade it down a wee bit, or it depends on the style. So it's hard for me to say exactly, but oftentimes going like with my boxy tee pattern, I'll use it for wovens and knits and they're all good. But I don't mind if the t-shirt knit version is a little bit looser. But if you want a tighter fit, more like Tina's wearing, then you might need to just size it down a wee bit. Although a quick and dirty cheating way to do that I often do is to like, let's see, if I was just teaching this the other day. If you take your pattern piece and just like scooch it like a 1/2 inch over the fold, that's going to reduce the circumference by 2 inches if you do that front and back. And that can be a quick and easy way to just use a woven pattern for a knit and have it be a little bit closer fitting. I'll
Nice.
stop talking.
Let's do this last question and then we'll say goodbye. But Jenny asks, do you have a self-sized mannequin?
I saw that question come up in a little bubble. No, I do not. I pretty much never, I shouldn't say pretty much. I have a mannequin, but I don't ever use it. And I really don't think we need mannequins. Like this is something people ask me a lot, like right in the beginning when they're like getting their sewing machine. They're like, oh, I need to get a mannequin too, right? I mean, if you want one, you know, some people do seem to enjoy using them, but the tricky thing is, like you said, it's hard to find one that's exactly your not just size, but shape. I know there are a bunch now that you can order them like custom made to your measurements, but I think they're pretty expensive. And I just try things on myself. Like cause it's not just about like how it fits a mannequin to me doesn't really help or give me enough information. Cause I want to know that I can like reach up to get something off a high shelf or like step across the pile of stuff on my floor, or you know, like I want to feel it and see it on me. So short answer, no, I don't have or use a mannequin that's my size or at all.
Oh, Cal, I'm so pleased that you picked up our series. I love talking with you, and I know that everyone else has had a wonderful time, I'm guessing as well. Is there any last thing that you want to share with us, like something at all? And then if not, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thanks for being here.
It went so quick. I can't wait to watch all the other talks. Last minute wisdom, just this is gonna sound really dumb, but just do it. Just don't hold back. Don't be afraid of fitting. Don't be afraid of using your fabric. Maybe use some less perfect fabric first and then use the favorite fabric. But like just do it. Like I don't think we ever regret you know, moving forward, and it brings such joy and satisfaction. And there sometimes are things that don't go as we planned, but you know, just do it. Keep making stuff, keep trying it, have fun.
Perfect. Thank you, Cal. So those of you who are listening, if you want to jump in tomorrow at noon, I'm going to talk with Nan Webb with Bolt and Spool. She has a fabric store and patterns, and I think that's going to be exciting to talk to somebody who's coming at it from a different angle. So, Cal, thank you again.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.